In the heart of Pennsylvania's Amish country, where tradition runs deeper than the roots of century-old oak trees, a story unfolds that will challenge everything two people believe about love, faith, and destiny. Sarah Matthews, a 28-year-old social worker from Philadelphia, arrives in Lancaster County to investigate reports of a troubled Amish community. What she doesn't expect is to encounter Ezra Stoltzfus, a 40-year-old giant of a man whose massive frame and fierce demeanor hide a heart broken by years of loss and isolation. When a misunderstanding leads to Ezra's shocking declaration that echoes through the quiet farmland, two worlds collide in ways neither could have imagined. As autumn leaves begin to fall and winter approaches, Sarah and Ezra must navigate the treacherous waters between their vastly different worlds, uncovering secrets that will forever change not just their lives, but the lives of an entire community. This is a story of forbidden love, second chances, and the power of hope to bridge even the widest gaps between hearts. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Lancaster County like a whisper from the past, and Sarah Matthews felt as out of place as a neon sign in a candlelit room. Her silver Honda Civic looked almost apologetic as it navigated the narrow country road, surrounded by horse-drawn buggies that moved with the unhurried rhythm of a simpler time. Sarah gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles white against her olive skin. At 28, she had handled some of the toughest cases Philadelphia's social services department could throw at her, but nothing had prepared her for this assignment. The complaint had been vague, reports of concerning behavior and potential child welfare issues in one of the more isolated Amish communities. Her supervisor had warned her that this wouldn't be like her usual urban cases. Different world out there, Matthews, Director Wilson had said, barely looking up from his coffee-stained paperwork. These people don't trust outsiders, especially government workers. But we've got 3 separate anonymous tips, so we have to investigate. Now, as Sarah pulled into the dirt driveway of the Stoltzfus farm, she wondered if those anonymous tips had been worth the 2-hour drive from the city. The farmhouse stood like something from a postcard, white clapboard siding, green shutters, and a wraparound porch that spoke of summer evenings and sweet tea. But there was something else in the air, something that made her instincts prickle with unease. She had barely stepped out of her car when she heard it, a sound that seemed to shake the very ground beneath her feet. It was a roar, deep and primal, filled with such raw pain that it stopped her cold. The sound came from the massive red barn that dominated the property, and Sarah felt every muscle in her body tense. "What in God's name?" she whispered, her hand instinctively reaching for her phone. The barn doors burst open with such force that one of them nearly came off its hinges. And then she saw him. Ezra Stoltzfus was not just tall, he was massive. 6 feet 8 inches of pure muscle and sinew, with shoulders so broad they seemed to blot out the sun. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, escaping from beneath his black felt hat, and his beard, thick and untamed, framed a face that looked carved from stone. But it was his eyes that caught Sarah's attention, and held it. They were the color of storm clouds, gray and turbulent, and filled with a pain so deep it seemed bottomless. He hadn't noticed her yet. His massive hands were clenched into fists at his sides, and his chest heaved with each labored breath. Sarah could see the sweat on his brow, the way his simple white shirt clung to his muscular frame. Everything about him spoke of barely contained power and overwhelming grief. "Ezra?" A gentle voice called from the farmhouse porch. An elderly woman emerged, her silver hair neatly pinned beneath a white prayer covering. Her face was lined with years of worry and love in equal measure. "Ezra, child, you must calm yourself." This had to be his mother, Sarah realized. The family resemblance was there in the strong jaw and the proud bearing, though where Ezra radiated, barely contained storm, the older woman emanated a steady, peaceful strength. "I cannot, Mom." Ezra's voice was like distant thunder, low and rumbling. "It's been 3 years, and still they whisper, still they judge, still they act as though I am cursed." Sarah took a careful step back toward her car, suddenly feeling like an intruder in this private moment of family pain. But her movement caught Ezra's attention, and those storm-gray eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "Who are you?" His voice carried across the farmyard like a challenge. "What business do you have here?" Sarah squared her shoulders, drawing on years of training and experience. She had faced down angry parents, hostile teenagers, and bureaucrats who seemed to view compassion as a weakness. She could handle one grieving Amish farmer, no matter how intimidating he looked. "I'm Sarah Matthews," she said, her voice steady and professional. "I'm with Philadelphia County Social Services. I'm here to investigate some concerns that have been brought to our attention." The words hung in the air between them like a loaded gun. Sarah watched as Ezra's face went through a series of emotions: confusion, recognition, and then something that looked suspiciously like betrayal. His mother's hand flew to her chest, and she sank down onto the porch steps as though her legs could no longer support her. "Social services," Ezra repeated, and there was something dangerous in his tone now. "You've come because of the whispers, because of the lies." He took a step toward her, then another. Sarah was not a small woman at 5'6". She had always considered herself reasonably tall, but as Ezra approached, she felt dwarfed by his massive presence. Still, she held her ground. "I'm here because we received reports of concerns regarding child welfare," Sarah said, keeping her voice calm and professional. "It's my job to investigate these reports and ensure that any children in the community are safe and properly cared for." "And child welfare?" Ezra's laugh was bitter and harsh. "And what children would those be, Miss Matthews? The children I was never allowed to have? The children my wife died trying to give me? The children this community whispers I am cursed, never to father?" Sarah felt her professional composure slip slightly. This was not what she had expected. The pain in Ezra's voice was raw and immediate, and she found herself responding to it on a human level rather than a professional one. "Miss Stoltzfus, You know nothing," he interrupted, his voice rising. "You come here with your government papers and your outsider's judgment, thinking you understand our ways, our pain, our struggles. But you know nothing about loss, nothing about being marked by God as unworthy, nothing about watching the woman you love die in agony because your seed is cursed." His words struck Sarah like physical blows. She had handled cases involving grief and loss before, but something about Ezra's pain resonated with her own carefully buried wounds. Her hand unconsciously moved to her lower abdomen, where her own dreams of motherhood had died 3 years ago in a sterile hospital room. "I know more than you might think," she said softly, surprising herself with the admission. Ezra stopped his advance, his gray eyes narrowing as he studied her face. For a moment the anger seemed to drain out of him, replaced by curiosity. "What did you say?" Sarah took a deep breath, knowing she was stepping far outside the boundaries of professional conduct. But something about this man, this moment, this place, was stripping away all her carefully constructed defenses. "I said I know more about loss than you might think," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know what it's like to want children so desperately that it physically hurts. I know what it's like to lose that dream and have people look at you with pity, or worse, like somehow it was your fault." The silence that followed was profound. Even the birds seemed to have stopped their morning songs. Ezra's massive frame went completely still, and Sarah could see him processing her words, searching her face for deception or manipulation. His mother rose from the porch steps and moved toward them with the fluid grace of someone who had spent decades mediating family conflict. "Perhaps," she said gently, "we should all go inside for some coffee and speak as civilized people rather than standing in the yard like strangers." But Ezra wasn't ready to stand down. His pain was too raw, too immediate, and Sarah's unexpected vulnerability had somehow made it worse rather than better. "You think sharing your sob story gives you the right to come here?" His voice was rising again, the storm clouds gathering once more in his eyes. You think because you've had your own troubles, you can understand what it's like to be marked by an entire community as cursed, to have people cross themselves when you pass, to have mothers pull their children away from you like you might contaminate them with your failure. He took another step closer, and now Sarah could see the individual grey flecks in his eyes, could smell the honest sweat of hard labor, and something else, something that spoke of sleepless nights and desperation. "I'll tell you what I told the last government worker who came sniffing around here," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "By winter, the right woman will carry my children. By winter, I will prove to this community and to God himself that I am not cursed. And if that threatens you somehow, if that scares your modern sensibilities, then you can climb back in your fancy car and drive back to your city where broken people are just statistics on your desk." Sarah felt her own anger rising in response to his aggression. She had come here to do her job, to protect children who might need protection, and instead she had found herself facing a man whose pain was so similar to her own that it felt like looking in a twisted mirror. "And just how do you plan to accomplish this miracle?" she shot back, her professional demeanor finally cracking. "Are you going to force some poor woman to bear your children? Is that what the reports are about? Some kind of coercion?" The words were out before Sarah could stop them, and she immediately regretted the accusation. But it was too late. Ezra's face went white with rage, and when he spoke, his voice carried such power that it seemed to echo off the surrounding hills. "By winter you'll birth my children." The declaration exploded from him like thunder from a clear sky. The words hung in the air between them, shocking in their intensity and their implication. Sarah felt her heart stop for a moment, then resume beating with such force she was sure everyone could hear it. Ezra's mother gasped and clutched her chest. From somewhere in the barn, horses whinnied in response to the commotion, and Sarah stood frozen, staring up at this giant of a man who had just made the most outrageous, impossible declaration she had ever heard. "What did you just say?" she whispered. Ezra seemed as shocked by his own words as she was. The color drained from his face, and his massive hands began to shake. He took a step back, then another, as though trying to distance himself from what he had just said. I didn't," he stammered, his voice hoarse. "Miss Matthews, I apologize. I don't know what came over me. The stress, the grief. Sometimes a man says things he doesn't mean." But Sarah wasn't listening to his apology. She was staring at his face, at the play of emotions across his rugged features, and she was seeing something that shocked her to her core. Because despite his words of apology, despite his obvious embarrassment, there was something in Ezra's eyes that suggested he had meant every word. And more terrifying still was the realization that somewhere deep in her broken heart, a part of her wanted to believe that such an impossible thing could be true. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, burning away the mist and leaving the three of them standing in harsh daylight, exposed and vulnerable. Sarah's professional training told her to get in her car and drive away, to file a report recommending further investigation by someone more objective. Her heart told her something entirely different. "Mr. Stoltzfus," she said finally, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. "I think we need to talk." The Stoltzfus farmhouse kitchen was a study in controlled chaos and timeless warmth. Copper pots gleamed from their hooks on the wall, and the massive wood-burning stove dominated one wall like a benevolent giant. Sarah found herself seated at a heavy oak table that had clearly seen decades of family meals, heated discussions, and quiet moments of prayer. The smell of fresh bread lingered in the air, mixing with the aroma of coffee that was stronger than anything she could get in Philadelphia. Ezra's mother, who had introduced herself as Ruth Stoltzfus, moved around the kitchen with the efficient grace of a woman who had been managing a household for 50 years. She set down 3 ceramic mugs of coffee and a plate of what looked like fresh cinnamon rolls, though her hands trembled slightly as she worked. "I apologize for my son's outburst," Ruth said, settling into the chair across from Sarah. These past 3 years have been difficult for him. Ezra sat at the head of the table, looking like a mountain that had somehow folded itself into a chair designed for normal-sized humans. His massive frame seemed barely contained by the wooden seat, and his hands wrapped around his coffee mug like he was afraid it might try to escape. The anger had drained out of him, leaving behind something that looked almost like shame. "Mrs. Stoltzfus," Sarah began, opening her notebook and trying to regain some semblance of professional composure. "I need to understand what's been happening here. We received 3 separate reports of concerning behavior, and I have to investigate each one thoroughly." Ruth's lined face creased with worry. "What kind of reports?" Sarah glanced at Ezra, who was staring into his coffee as though it might contain the answers to all of life's problems. "Reports of a man making threats about forcing women to bear his children. Reports of erratic behavior and potential violence." The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of an old clock on the mantelpiece. Ruth's hand flew to her throat, and Ezra's grip on his mug tightened until Sarah was afraid the ceramic might crack. "That's not," Ruth began, then stopped, her eyes moving between Sarah and her son. "Miss Matthews, I think there are things you need to understand about our situation, about what happened to Ezra and Rebecca." "Mom, no." Ezra's voice was low but firm. "She doesn't need to hear our private matters." "Yes, she does," Ruth said, her tone carrying the authority of a mother who had raised children and buried husbands, "because someone in our community is spreading lies, and if we don't tell the truth, those lies will become the only story people hear." Sarah leaned forward, her pen poised over her notebook. "I'm listening." Ruth took a deep breath, her weathered hands smoothing her apron. "Rebecca, she was the light of Ezra's life. They were married young, as is our way, and they wanted children desperately. For 7 years she tried to conceive. 7 long years of hope and disappointment." Ezra's jaw clenched, and Sarah could see the muscle jumping beneath his beard. "Mom, hush, child. She needs to know." Ruth's voice grew softer, more distant. "Rebecca was delicate, built small like a bird. The doctor in town warned us that pregnancy might be dangerous for her, but she was determined. She said God would provide." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had a feeling she knew where this story was going, and it was nowhere good. 3 years ago," Ruth continued, "Rebecca finally conceived. We were all so happy, so grateful, but from the beginning something was wrong. She was sick constantly, couldn't keep food down, lost weight instead of gaining it. The doctor told her to rest." Ezra spoke for the first time, his voice barely above a whisper. "Told her to take it easy. But Rebecca, she was so afraid of losing the baby that she did everything she could think of, worked twice as hard around the farm, prayed twice as long, ate twice as much when she could keep it down." Sarah's own painful memories stirred, and she had to force herself to maintain professional distance. "What happened?" Ruth's eyes filled with tears. "The baby came early, 2 months early. Rebecca had been in labor for 3 days when we finally got her to the hospital in Lancaster. They did everything they could, but the baby lived for 6 hours," Ezra said flatly. 6 hours. Rebecca held him for all 6 hours, whispering prayers and promises she couldn't keep, and then he just stopped breathing. The kitchen fell silent except for the soft sound of Ruth sweeping. Sarah felt her own eyes burning and had to blink rapidly to clear them. "Rebecca never recovered," Ruth continued through her tears. "Not physically, not emotionally. She blamed herself, said she had failed God and failed Ezra. The infection set in 2 days after we brought her home from the hospital, and by the time we realized how serious it was, she died holding my hand." Ezra finished, his voice breaking, "apologizing to me for not giving me children, for failing as a wife. Those were her last words, an apology for something that was never her fault." Sarah closed her notebook and set down her pen. This was no longer an interview or an investigation. This was raw human grief, and it demanded a different kind of attention. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly. "Both of you, that's an unimaginable loss." "The community rallied around us at first," Ruth said, wiping her eyes with her apron. "Brought food, helped with the harvest, but as time went on, people began to whisper. Some said Ezra was cursed, that God was punishing him for some secret sin. Others said Rebecca's death was a sign that some bloodlines weren't meant to continue." "That's ridiculous," Sarah said, with more heat than she intended. "Grief and medical complications aren't punishments from God." Ezra looked up at her for the first time since they had come inside, and she was startled by the intensity in his grey eyes. "You sound very certain about God's intentions, Miss Matthews. Are you a woman of faith?" The question caught Sarah off guard. In her line of work, religious discussions were usually something to be navigated carefully, diplomatically, but something about Ezra's direct gaze made her want to answer honestly. "I was raised Catholic," she said, "but I've had some disagreements with God over the years. About fairness, about why bad things happen to people who are trying their best to live good lives." A ghost of a smile touched Ezra's lips. "Disagreements with God. I like that phrasing, much more honest than most people manage." Ruth looked between them with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read. "Miss Matthews, may I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Earlier outside you said you knew about loss, about wanting children. If you don't mind me asking, what did you mean?" Sarah hesitated. Every professional instinct she had told her not to share personal information with subjects of an investigation. But sitting in this warm kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of decades of family life, she found those professional boundaries feeling less important than human connection. "3 years ago," she said slowly, "I was engaged to a man I thought I would spend my life with. David. We had been trying to have a baby for 2 years. When I finally got pregnant, we were over the moon. We picked out names, bought furniture, planned our whole future around this child." Ruth's weathered hand reached across the table and covered Sarah's. "What happened, dear?" "I miscarried at 22 weeks, Sarah said, the words still difficult to speak after all this time. "Far enough along that we knew it was a little girl. Emma." We had already picked the name Emma. Ezra's massive frame went completely still. "I'm sorry. The doctor said it was a fluke, a random genetic abnormality. Nothing anyone could have predicted or prevented. But David couldn't handle it. He said being around me reminded him too much of what we had lost. He ended the engagement 6 months later and married someone else within the year. They have 2 children now." The silence that followed was comfortable rather than awkward, the silence of people who understood that some pain was too deep for words. "So when you talk about feeling cursed," Sarah continued, looking directly at Ezra, "about feeling like God has marked you as unworthy of children, I understand that feeling. I understand the way people look at you afterward, like you're broken, like your loss might be contagious." Ezra studied her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed and vulnerable. "And yet you chose to work with children, even after losing your own." Sarah had never really thought about it in those terms, but she realized he was right. "I suppose I did. Maybe I figured if I couldn't have my own children, at least I could help protect other people's children." "That's either very noble or very masochistic," Ezra observed. Despite everything, Sarah found herself smiling. Probably a little of both. Ruth stood up and moved to the stove, busying herself with what looked like preparations for lunch. But Sarah could tell she was listening to every word. "Miss Matthews," Ezra said carefully, "I need you to understand something about what happened outside, about what I said to you." Sarah felt her heart rate pick up. She had been trying not to think about his shocking declaration, but it had been running through her mind like a broken record. "Okay. For 3 years I've been dealing with whispers and rumors and people treating me like I'm cursed. Last month at a community gathering, one of the elders suggested that perhaps God was telling me to remain unmarried, to accept that some men aren't meant to father children." His hands clenched into fists on the table, and Sarah could see the barely controlled anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. I lost my temper, he continued. I told them that before winter came, I would prove them all wrong, that I would find a wife and she would carry my children, and everyone would see that God hadn't cursed me after all. And someone overheard this? Sarah asked. Several someones, and apparently the way I said it, the anger in my voice, it sounded like a threat, like I was planning to force some woman to marry me and bear my children. Sarah nodded slowly. And that's what led to the reports. It must be, because the truth is, Miss Matthews, I have no prospects for marriage. The unmarried women in our community are either too young or too afraid of the supposed curse, and I'm too old and too angry and too heartbroken to court anyone properly. Ruth turned from the stove, a wooden spoon in her hand. Ezra Stoltzfus, you are not too old for anything. You're 40 years old, not 80. And you're not cursed, no matter what small-minded people might whisper. Then explain to me, ma'am, why every woman I've spoken to since Rebecca died has found an excuse to avoid me. Explain why mothers pull their daughters away when I approach at church gatherings. The pain in his voice was so raw that Sarah felt it like a physical blow. She found herself wanting to comfort him, to tell him that the right woman would come along. But she knew how empty such platitudes sounded when you were drowning in grief and loneliness. Maybe, she said carefully, the problem isn't that you're cursed. Maybe the problem is that you're trying to prove something instead of just living your life. Ezra's grey eyes fixed on her with startling intensity. What do you mean? I mean that desperation has a smell to it. When someone is trying so hard to prove they're worthy of love or children or happiness, it can actually push people away. Not because they think you're cursed, but because they can sense that you're not approaching them for the right reason. Ruth set down her spoon and turned to face them fully. The child has a point, Ezra. I'm 28, not a child, Sarah said with mild protest. But she was smiling. You're a child to me, dear, but you're a wise child. Ruth moved back to the table and sat down. Miss Matthews, can I ask you something else? Sure. What are your plans? I mean your long-term plans. Career, family, life. The question seemed to come out of nowhere, and Sarah wasn't sure how to answer. I'm focused on my career right now. I have a good position with the county, and I'm making a difference in children's lives. As for family, she shrugged. I've pretty much accepted that ship has sailed. You're 28, Ruth said firmly. That ship hasn't even left the harbor yet. Ezra was studying Sarah again with that unnervingly direct gaze. Do you want children? Still, I mean after everything that happened? The question hit her like a punch to the gut. It was something she had avoided thinking about for 3 years, burying the desire so deep that she could pretend it didn't exist. Yes, she admitted, the word barely audible, more than anything. But wanting something and being able to have it are two different things. Sometimes, Ruth said quietly, God works in mysterious ways. Sometimes what looks like a curse is actually a blessing in disguise. Sarah looked between Ruth and Ezra, sensing undercurrents in the conversation that she couldn't quite grasp. What are you saying? Before either of them could answer, the sound of horse hooves on gravel announced the arrival of visitors. Ruth hurried to the window, her face brightening. It's Bishop Miller and Elder Schmidt, she announced. They must have heard about Miss Matthews' visit. Ezra's face went white, then red with anger. They're here to make sure I don't embarrass the community any further. Sarah felt a twist of anxiety in her stomach. She was already in deeper than she should be, emotionally invested, in a case that should have remained clinical and professional. The last thing she needed was to get caught in the middle of some internal community conflict. But as she watched Ezra's massive frame tense with barely controlled rage, as she saw the worry lines deepen on Ruth's kind face, Sarah realized she was already caught. Somewhere between the coffee and the shared stories of loss, between Ezra's shocking declaration and her own unexpected honesty, she had stopped being just a social worker investigating a case. She had become something much more dangerous, someone who cared about the outcome. The horse hooves came to a stop outside the kitchen window, and Sarah could hear low voices conferring in what she assumed was Pennsylvania Dutch. Whatever was about to happen, she had a feeling it was going to change everything. "Mrs. Stoltzfus," she said quietly, "maybe I should go. I don't want to cause problems for your family." "Nonsense," Ruth said firmly, but Sarah could see the worry in her eyes. "You're our guest. And besides, it might be good for Bishop Miller to hear your perspective on things." Ezra stood up, his massive frame unfolding like a mountain coming to life. "They're not here to listen to anyone's perspective, Ma'am. They're here to make sure I understand my place in this community." A knock at the kitchen door interrupted whatever Sarah might have said in response. Ruth smoothed her apron and went to answer it, ushering in two elderly men who radiated the kind of quiet authority that came from decades of leadership. Bishop Miller was tall and lean, with piercing blue eyes and a white beard that reached nearly to his waist. Elder Schmidt was shorter and rounder, with kind eyes and hands that looked like they had seen a lifetime of honest labor. "Ruth," Bishop Miller said in accented English, nodding politely, "we heard you had a visitor." His eyes found Sarah, taking in her modern clothes and professional bearing with the careful assessment of someone used to evaluating outsiders. "This is Miss Sarah Matthews," Ruth said. "She's from Philadelphia County Social Services. She came to investigate some reports about our Ezra." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Bishop Miller's face remained neutral, but Sarah could sense his displeasure like a physical force. "Miss Matthews," he said formally, "I am Bishop Miller, and this is Elder Schmidt. We lead this community in spiritual matters. Perhaps you would be so kind as to explain the nature of these reports." Sarah felt like she was walking through a minefield. Every word she spoke could have consequences she couldn't predict for people she was rapidly coming to care about. "There were reports of concerning behavior," she said carefully. "Threats regarding women and children. It's my job to investigate such reports, to ensure community safety." Elder Schmidt spoke for the first time, his voice gentle but firm. "And have you found evidence of these threats?" Sarah looked at Ezra, who was standing rigid with tension, and then at Ruth, whose kind eyes were pleading for understanding. "I found a man dealing with profound grief and loss," Sarah said slowly. "A man who may have spoken in anger and desperation, but who poses no threat to women or children." Bishop Miller's eyebrows rose slightly. "You've reached this conclusion very quickly, Miss Matthews. You've been here less than 2 hours." "Sometimes understanding doesn't require a lot of time," Sarah replied. "It just requires listening." "And what has your listening told you?" Elder Schmidt asked. Sarah took a deep breath, knowing she was about to step even further outside the bounds of professional conduct. "It's told me that Ezra Stoltzfus is not a threat to this community. He's an asset to it. A man who has suffered tremendous loss, but who continues to work hard, care for his mother, and contribute to the community that raised him. The reports you received were based on misunderstandings and gossip, not on any real danger." The kitchen fell silent. Bishop Miller and Elder Schmidt exchanged glances that spoke of years of shared leadership and decision-making. Ruth looked grateful, but worried, and Ezra was staring at Sarah with an expression she couldn't read. "Miss Matthews," Bishop Miller said finally, "you seem to have formed quite an attachment to our Ezra situation." The words carried a weight that made Sarah's cheeks burn. "I've formed a professional opinion based on my assessment of the facts." "Of course," Elder Schmidt said gently, "and we appreciate your thoroughness, but we must ask what happens now. Will there be further investigation? Will other government workers come?" Sarah realized she was at a crossroads. Her report would determine whether this case remained open or closed, whether Ezra and his family would continue to face scrutiny, or be left in peace. "That depends," she said carefully, "on whether I believe the situation has been resolved." "And do you?" Bishop Miller asked. Sarah looked around the warm kitchen, at Ruth's hopeful face and Ezra's guarded expression, at two community leaders who clearly cared deeply about their people's well-being. "I believe," she said slowly, that this situation requires ongoing monitoring. Ezra's face fell, and Ruth's hand flew to her throat. But Sarah wasn't finished. I believe it requires monitoring by someone who understands the complexities involved. Someone who can ensure that all parties are supported appropriately. Bishop Miller's eyes narrowed. What exactly are you proposing, Miss Matthews? Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. She was about to suggest something that went against every rule in her professional handbook, something that could cost her job if her supervisor found out. But as she looked at Ezra's face, at the pain and hope warring in his grey eyes, she knew she couldn't walk away. I'm proposing that I handle this case personally, she said, that I maintain regular contact with the family to ensure ongoing stability and community integration, that I serve as a liaison between the Stoltzfus family and any future concerns that might arise. The silence stretched so long that Sarah began to wonder if she had made a terrible mistake. Then Ruth smiled, an expression of such radiant joy that it transformed her entire face. That's very kind of you, dear, she said. Very kind indeed. Bishop Miller looked less convinced. Miss Matthews, our community values its privacy. We're not accustomed to ongoing government supervision. It wouldn't be supervision, Sarah said quickly. More like support. I could help navigate any future misunderstandings, serve as an advocate if needed. And I could learn more about Amish culture and customs, which would help me do my job better. Elder Schmidt smiled for the first time since he had arrived. She has a point, Bishop. Understanding leads to better relationships. Bishop Miller considered this, his piercing blue eyes moving from Sarah to Ezra and back again. And you, Ezra, what do you think of Miss Matthews' proposal? All eyes turned to Ezra, who had remained silent through the entire exchange. His massive frame seemed to fill the entire corner of the kitchen, and Sarah found herself holding her breath as she waited for his response. I think, he said slowly, his deep voice careful and measured, that Miss Matthews is a woman of integrity who wants to help. And I think I could use some help. The admission seemed to cost him something, but there was relief in his voice as well, as though he had been carrying a burden alone for so long that the idea of sharing it, even with a stranger, felt like a gift. Very well, Bishop Miller said finally. We will accept Miss Matthews' offer of ongoing support, but there will be conditions. Of course, Sarah said quickly. You will respect our customs and our privacy. You will not interfere with our internal community matters, unless there is genuine danger. And you will remember that we are not a curiosity to be studied, but a community of people trying to live according to our faith. I understand completely. Elder Schmidt stood up, smoothing his beard. Then I believe we have reached an understanding. Ruth, thank you for your hospitality. Ezra, we hope this arrangement will bring you some peace. After the two church leaders left, the kitchen fell into a comfortable quiet. Ruth busied herself clearing away the coffee cups, humming softly under her breath. Ezra remained seated at the table, staring out the window at the rolling hills of his family's farm. Miss Matthews, he said without looking at her, why did you do that? Do what? Offer to stay involved. You could have closed this case and walked away, gone back to your life in Philadelphia. Instead, you've committed yourself to driving out here regularly to check on a family of strangers. Sarah considered the question seriously. It deserved an honest answer. Because 3 years ago, when my world fell apart, no one stayed, she said quietly. Everyone was very sorry for my loss, very understanding about my grief. But in the end, everyone went back to their own lives and left me to figure out how to put the pieces back together alone. She looked at Ezra, meeting his grey eyes directly. And because when you made that declaration outside, about having children by winter, for just a moment, I believed you. Not because I thought you could force it to happen, but because I could hear how desperately you wanted it to be true. And I know what that kind of desperation feels like. Ezra was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, It's October now. Yes, it is. Winter comes early in Pennsylvania. I imagine it does. That doesn't give a man much time. Sarah smiled. Despite everything. No, it doesn't. Ruth turned from the sink, a dish rag in her hands and mischief in her eyes. Well then, she said cheerfully, I suppose we'd better get started. 2 weeks had passed since Sarah's first visit to the Stoltzfus farm, and she found herself making the drive to Lancaster County every few days. What had started as professional obligation had evolved into something she couldn't quite name, a mixture of duty, curiosity, and a growing attachment that kept her awake at night, questioning her own motives. The October air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the maple trees lining the country roads had erupted in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. Sarah had always loved autumn, but this year the changing seasons felt loaded with significance, each falling leaf a reminder that time was passing and winter was approaching. She pulled into the familiar dirt driveway of the Stoltzfus farm, noting that Ezra was working in the vegetable garden, harvesting the last of the season's crops. Even from a distance, his massive frame was unmistakable as he moved between the rows with surprising grace for such a large man. He had shed his jacket in the warm afternoon sun, and Sarah found herself noticing the way his white shirt stretched across his broad shoulders. She shook her head, annoyed with herself. This was exactly the kind of thinking that could get her into serious professional trouble. Ezra Stoltzfus was a subject of investigation, not a man to be admired from afar like some romance novel hero. But as she got out of her car and he looked up from his work, flashing her a genuine smile that transformed his entire face, Sarah had to admit that her feelings were becoming increasingly difficult to categorize as purely professional. "Miss Matthews," he called out, wiping his hands on a cloth tucked into his belt. "You're early today. I finished my other appointments ahead of schedule," she said, walking toward him across the brown grass. "And please, call me Sarah. We've moved past formalities, don't you think?" Something flickered in his gray eyes, approval maybe, or pleasure. "Sarah then, and you should call me Ezra." The use of first names felt significant somehow, like crossing an invisible line they had both been dancing around for 2 weeks. Sarah felt a flutter of nervous energy in her stomach that had nothing to do with professional anxiety. "How's the harvest coming?" she asked, nodding toward the baskets of vegetables scattered around the garden. "Well enough. Mom's been after me to get the last of the potatoes up before the first hard frost." He gestured toward a section of the garden where the earth had been rusty turned. "We should have enough root vegetables to last through the winter." There was that word again, winter. It seemed to lurk in every conversation they had, a deadline that grew more pressing with each passing day. Sarah had done the math. If Ezra's declaration was to come true, if some woman was indeed going to birth his children by winter, conception would need to happen very soon. The thought made her cheeks warm in a way that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. "Sarah," Ezra said, his voice dropping to a more serious tone, "there's something I need to discuss with you. Something important." The butterflies in her stomach multiplied. "What is it?" Instead of answering immediately, he set down his tools and gestured toward the farmhouse. "Let's go inside. Mom has been baking all morning, and she'll never forgive me if I don't invite you to try her apple strudel." As they walked toward the house, Sarah noticed that Ezra seemed nervous, which was unusual for him. Over the past 2 weeks, she had seen him angry, grief-stricken, and vulnerable, but never nervous. Whatever he wanted to discuss was clearly weighing heavily on his mind. Ruth met them at the kitchen door, her face lighting up at the sight of Sarah. Over the past 2 weeks, the older woman had treated Sarah less like a government worker and more like a beloved daughter-in-law, a development that both warmed Sarah's heart and made her deeply uncomfortable. "Sarah, dear, perfect timing," Ruth said, ushering them into the warm kitchen. "I just pulled the strudel from the oven, and I made that herbal tea you liked so much." The kitchen smelled like cinnamon and apples and the indefinable comfort of a home where people were genuinely cared for. Sarah had grown up in a series of foster homes after her parents died in a car accident when she was 12, and she had never experienced the kind of unconditional maternal warmth that Ruth offered so freely. "Miss Stoltzfus," Ruth, you don't need to go to so much trouble for me. Sarah protested as the older woman bustled around, preparing plates and cups with the efficiency of someone who had been hosting guests for decades. Nonsense, Ruth said firmly. It's no trouble at all. Besides, we need to discuss some important matters, and discussions always go better with good food. Sarah caught the meaningful look that passed between Ruth and Ezra, and her nervous energy ratcheted up another notch. What kind of important matters? Ezra waited until they were all seated around the familiar oak table before speaking. Sarah, these past 2 weeks, having you come around the farm, it's been good for all of us. You've brought a perspective we needed, and your support with the church leaders has made a real difference in how the community treats me. I'm glad I could help, Sarah said carefully, sensing that this was leading somewhere significant. But we have a problem, Ruth interjected, cutting generous slices of strudel and placing them in front of Sarah and Ezra. A serious problem that requires a creative solution. Sarah's heart began to beat faster. What kind of problem? Ezra leaned back in his chair, which creaked ominously under his weight. Word has gotten out in the community about my declaration, about my promise to prove I'm not cursed by having children before winter comes. And, Sarah prompted when he paused, and people are starting to place bets, Ruth said with obvious disgust. Actual money changing hands over whether my son will be able to find a wife and father a child in the next few weeks. Sarah felt a surge of anger on Ezra's behalf. That's horrible. People shouldn't be making light of something so personal. It gets worse, Ezra said grimly. Some of the younger men in the community have started approaching unmarried women, telling them they could make easy money by pretending to court me and then rejecting me publicly. They're turning my desperation into entertainment. Oh, Ezra, Sarah breathed, her heart breaking for him. I'm so sorry. Bishop Miller came by yesterday, Ruth added. He's concerned that this situation is becoming disruptive to community harmony. He suggested that perhaps Reza should publicly apologize for his boastful words and accept that God's will is for him to remain unmarried. Sarah could see the pain and humiliation in Ezra's eyes, and she felt a fierce protective instinct rise within her. You can't be serious. You're going to let them shame you into giving up on the possibility of having a family. What choice do I have? Ezra asked, his voice heavy with defeat. I've approached every eligible woman in the community. Some won't even speak to me. Others listen politely and then find excuses to avoid me afterward. And now, with this betting nonsense, any woman who shows interest will be suspected of ulterior motives. Sarah stared at him, her mind racing. There had to be a solution, some way to help him out of this impossible situation. But every option she could think of seemed to lead to more complications. There is one possibility, Ruth said quietly, her weathered hands folded carefully in her lap. One way Ezra could fulfill his declaration and prove to the community that he's not cursed. Both Sarah and Ezra looked at her expectantly. He could marry someone from outside the community, Ruth continued. Someone who hasn't been influenced by the gossip and rumors. Someone who understands his situation and genuinely cares about his well-being. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a doused fire. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as she realized what Ruth was suggesting. Mrs. Stoltzfus, she said carefully, I think I should clarify my role here. I'm a social worker, a government employee. IKs. Why not? Ruth asked with the directness that Sarah was learning was characteristic of Amish communication. You're a good woman. You understand Ezra's pain because you've experienced similar loss. You want children as much as he does. And you're clearly not motivated by money or social status. Sarah's hands began to shake, and she set down her teacup before she could drop it. This is completely inappropriate. Is it? Ezra asked quietly, and when Sarah looked at him, she was stunned by the intensity in his grey eyes. Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Okay, she whispered. Over these past 2 weeks, have you felt anything at all beyond professional concern? The question hit her like a physical blow. Sarah opened her mouth to give the professional, appropriate response, to maintain the boundaries that her training and common sense demanded. Instead, she heard herself say, "Yes." The single word seemed to echo in the quiet kitchen. Ruth smiled with obvious satisfaction, while Ezra's face registered a complex mixture of relief, hope, and something that looked like wonder. "What have you felt?" he pressed gently. Sarah took a shaky breath. "I felt connected to you, to your pain, your hopes, your determination to build a family despite everything you've been through. I felt like I understand you in a way that I don't understand most people." "And," Ruth prompted when Sarah paused, "and I felt attracted to you," Sarah admitted, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. "Which is completely inappropriate and could cost me my job and probably means I should remove myself from this case immediately." Ezra leaned forward, his massive hands flat on the table. "What if I told you that I felt the same way? That these past 2 weeks, you've been the first thing I think about when I wake up and the last thing I think about before I fall asleep." Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. "Ezra, what if I told you that when I made that declaration about having children by winter, somewhere in my heart I was already thinking about you, even though I barely knew you, even though it was impossible, some part of me was imagining what it would be like if you were the woman who could make that declaration come true." The kitchen spun around Sarah like a carnival ride. This was insane. This was professional suicide. This was the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to her. "You're proposing marriage," she said faintly, "to someone you've known for 2 weeks. "I'm proposing a solution," Ruth interjected practically. "A solution that benefits everyone involved." "How?" Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she really wanted to hear the answer. Ruth ticked off points on her fingers. "Ezra gets a wife who genuinely cares for him and wants the same things he wants. You get a husband who understands your loss and shares your desire for children. The community sees that Ezra is not cursed, which restores his standing and allows him to live in peace. And if God wills it, you both get the children you've been longing for." "And if God doesn't will it?" Sarah asked. "If we can't have children together?" Ezra reached across the table and covered her trembling hand with his massive one. His skin was warm and calloused from years of farm work, and Sarah felt an electric shock at the contact. "Then we'll face that disappointment together instead of alone," he said simply. "And we'll find other ways to build a family. Adoption, fostering, taking in children who need homes. There are many ways to be parents, Sarah." The practical part of Sarah's mind was screaming warnings about the insanity of what they were discussing. She barely knew this man. She would be giving up her career, her life in Philadelphia, everything familiar and safe. She would be marrying into a culture she didn't understand, committing to a lifestyle that was completely foreign to her experience. But another part of her mind, a part that had been locked away since David left her, was whispering something different. It was whispering about the way Ezra looked at her like she was something precious and rare, about the way Ruth treated her like family, about the peace she felt in this simple kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of generations of love and commitment. "This is crazy," she said out loud. "Yes," Ezra agreed. "It's completely crazy. I could lose my job. I could lose everything." "You could," Ruth acknowledged, "or you could gain everything you've ever wanted." Sarah pulled her hand free from Ezra's and stood up, pacing to the window that looked out over the rolling farmland. The late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the fields, and she could see the last of the season's corn standing in neat rows, waiting for harvest. "How would it even work?" she asked without turning around. "I'm not Amish. I don't know your customs, your beliefs, your way of life." "You could learn," Ruth said gently. "Faith and practice can be taught, but kindness and integrity, those are gifts you already possess. And what about the physical aspect? Sarah asked, her cheeks burning again. I mean, if children are the goal, we would need to. She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence that would make this conversation even more surreal than it already was. Sarah, Ezra's voice was low and careful. If you agreed to this arrangement, I would never pressure you into anything you weren't ready for. We could take things slowly, build a real relationship based on trust and mutual respect. And when you were ready for the physical aspects of marriage, I would do everything in my power to make sure you felt safe and cherished. The sincerity in his voice made tears spring to Sarah's eyes. When was the last time a man had spoken to her about physical intimacy in terms of making her feel cherished rather than satisfied? What about love? She asked, still staring out the window. What if we never fall in love with each other? What if we do? Ezra countered. Sarah turned around to face him and was surprised by the hope she saw in his grey eyes. You think we could? I think, he said slowly, that love grows from understanding, respect, and shared goals. I think it grows from facing life's challenges together and celebrating its joys together. And I think we already have the foundation for all of those things. Ruth stood up and moved to Sarah's side, placing a gentle hand on her arm. Dear, I've been married twice in my life, once for passionate love, when I was young, and once for companionate love, when I was older. Both marriages were happy, but in different ways. What do you say? I'm saying that there are many different kinds of love, and the kind that builds slowly from friendship and mutual respect often proves more durable than the kind that burns hot and fast. Sarah looked between Ruth and Ezra, these people who had somehow become so important to her in such a short time. The logical part of her mind was still screaming warnings, but her heart was whispering something different. Her heart was whispering that this might be her chance for the family she had always wanted, her chance for a love that was based on understanding rather than passion, her chance to build something real and lasting with someone who truly saw her. If I said yes, she said slowly, how would we do this? I mean logistically. Ezra's face lit up with an expression of such pure joy that Sarah felt her remaining defenses crumble. There are procedures for outsiders who want to join our community. You would need to meet with Bishop Miller and demonstrate your commitment to our way of life. You would need to learn our customs, our language, our faith practices. How long does that usually take? Normally? A year or more, Ruth said, but given the circumstances, and given that you're marrying into the community rather than converting alone, the process could be accelerated. How accelerated? A few weeks, Ezra said quietly. If you were serious about this, if you were committed to making it work, we could be married before the first snow falls. Sarah felt dizzy. This was all happening so fast, too fast for rational thought or careful consideration. But as she looked at Ezra's hopeful face and felt Ruth's encouraging presence beside her, she realized that maybe rational thought wasn't what this situation required. Maybe what it required was faith. Faith in the possibility that two broken people could heal each other. Faith in the idea that love could grow from the most unlikely circumstances. Faith in the chance that her deepest dreams might actually come true. I need some time to think, she said finally. It's a lot to process. Of course, Ezra said, though she could see the disappointment in his eyes. Take all the time you need. How much time do we have? Sarah asked. I mean, if your declaration is going to come true, first snow usually comes in mid-November, Ruth said practically. So if we're going to do this, we need to start the process soon. Sarah nodded, her mind spinning with the implications of what they were discussing. She was considering giving up her entire life to marry a man she had known for 2 weeks, join a religious community she barely understood, and commit to having children with someone who might forever remain a stranger to her. It was the most insane thing she had ever contemplated. It was also the most hopeful she had felt in 3 years. I'll give you my answer in 3 days, she said finally. That should be enough time to think this through properly. 3 days, Ezra repeated, as though he were memorizing the deadline. As Sarah drove back to Philadelphia that evening, her mind churned with possibilities and fears in equal measure. She thought about her small apartment in the city, her demanding job, her carefully structured life that left little room for spontaneity or risk. She thought about Ezra's gentle hands and storm-gray eyes, about Ruth's maternal warmth and the peaceful rhythm of farm life. She thought about the possibility of waking up every morning next to someone who understood her deepest longings, of building a family with someone who wanted children as desperately as she did. By the time she reached her apartment, Sarah Matthews had made her decision. She just needed 3 days to work up the courage to follow through with it. Sarah had always prided herself on being a rational decision-maker. In her work, she analyzed facts, weighed evidence, and made recommendations based on careful consideration of all available information. But as she sat in her small Philadelphia apartment on the 3rd morning after Ezra's proposal, surrounded by the debris of sleepless nights and endless deliberation, she realized that some decisions couldn't be made with spreadsheets and pro and con lists. Her coffee table was covered with yellow legal pads filled with her careful handwriting. Lists of reasons to say yes, lists of reasons to say no, lists of practical considerations, and lists of potential consequences. She had called in sick to work for 2 days, claiming a stomach bug, while she wrestled with the most important decision of her life. The rational arguments against accepting Ezra's proposal were overwhelming. She would be giving up her career, her independence, her entire way of life. She would be marrying a man she barely knew, joining a religious community that might never fully accept her, committing to a lifestyle that was completely foreign to everything she had ever known. But every time she started to convince herself that saying no was the only sensible option, she would remember the way Ezra had looked at her when he talked about facing disappointment together, instead of alone. She would remember Ruth's gentle wisdom about different kinds of love and the peace she felt in that warm farmhouse kitchen. More than that, she would remember the emptiness in her own life, the way she had been going through the motions for 3 years without really living. Her apartment felt like a holding cell, her job felt like a distraction, and her future felt like a blank page with no words written on it. The sound of her phone ringing jolted her out of her reverie. She glanced at the caller ID and felt her heart skip a beat. It was her supervisor, Director Wilson. Matthews, his gruff voice came through the speaker when she answered. "How's that stomach bug? You planning to grace us with your presence today?" "I'm feeling better," Sarah lied. "I should be in this afternoon." "Good, because I need to talk to you about that Amish case you've been working. The one in Lancaster County." Sarah's blood ran cold. "What about it?" "I got a call from the state office yesterday. Apparently someone filed a complaint about your handling of the case, said you've been making personal visits that go beyond the scope of professional responsibility." The room seemed to spin around Sarah. "Who filed the complaint?" "Anonymous tip, but they provided specific details about your visits, how long you've been staying, the frequency of contact." "Sarah, please tell me you haven't been getting personally involved with these people." Sarah closed her eyes, knowing that her answer would determine not just the future of her case, but the future of her entire career. "I've been providing appropriate follow-up support," she said carefully. "That's not what I asked. Have you been getting personally involved?" The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Sarah could hear the disappointment in Wilson's breathing, could almost see him shaking his head at her unprofessional conduct. "Sarah," he said finally, his voice gentler than she expected, "I've known you for 5 years. You're one of the best social workers I've ever supervised. You're thorough, compassionate, and professional. So when someone tells me you've been spending inappropriate amounts of time with a case subject, I know something serious is going on. Mr. Wilson, are you in love with him?" The question was so direct, so unexpected, that Sarah found herself answering before she could think. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Maybe. It's complicated." Wilson sighed heavily. "Sarah, I need you to come in today. We need to discuss reassigning this case and possibly placing you on administrative leave while we review your conduct, please, Sarah said, surprising herself with the desperation in her voice. Give me until the end of the day. Let me close this case properly. I promise I'll explain everything when I come in. Sarah, please. 24 hours. That's all I'm asking. Another long pause. 24 hours, Wilson said finally. But if you don't show up tomorrow morning with a full explanation and a plan for transferring this case, I'll have no choice but to recommend your termination. The line went dead, leaving Sarah staring at her phone in stunned silence. Her career was over. Whether she accepted Ezra's proposal or not, her life, as she knew it, was ending. The anonymous complaint had seen to that. But as she sat there, processing the implications of Wilson's call, Sarah realized something surprising. Instead of panic or despair, she felt relief. The decision had been made for her. She no longer had to choose between her career and her heart, because her career was already lost. Now the only question was whether she had the courage to reach for something new. Sarah showered and dressed with more care than she had in days, choosing a simple blue dress that brought out her eyes and made her feel confident and feminine. If she was going to change her entire life today, she wanted to look like a woman who was ready for whatever came next. The drive to Lancaster County passed in a blur of autumn scenery and churning thoughts. Sarah found herself mentally rehearsing what she would say to Ezra, how she would explain her decision and what it meant for both of their futures. She pulled into the familiar driveway of the Stoltzfus farm, just as the church bells in the distance were chiming noon. Ezra was working in the barn, and she could hear the rhythmic sound of hammering as she approached. When she appeared in the doorway, he looked up from the workbench where he was repairing what looked like a broken plow blade. "Sarah," he said, setting down his hammer, "I wasn't expecting you until later. I know, I couldn't wait any longer." She took a deep breath, steadying herself for what she was about to say. "I have news, good news and bad news." Ezra's face went carefully neutral, and Sarah could see him bracing himself for disappointment. "What's the bad news?" "I'm about to lose my job. Someone filed a complaint about my unprofessional conduct on this case. My supervisor wants to see me tomorrow morning, and unless I can convince him that I haven't been personally involved with you, I'll probably be terminated." Ezra's face went white. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. This is my fault, my declaration, the attention it brought." "It's not your fault," Sarah interrupted. "And besides, that's not the important part." "What's the important part?" Sarah stepped closer to him, close enough to see the individual whiskers in his dark beard, close enough to smell the honest scent of sawdust and hard work that seemed to cling to him. "The important part is that losing my job made me realize something. I've been so focused on what I'd be giving up by accepting your proposal that I forgot to think about what I'd be gaining." Hope flickered in Ezra's gray eyes. "And what would you be gaining?" "A partner who understands my deepest longings. A chance to build the family I've always wanted. A life with meaning and purpose beyond filing reports and attending meetings." She reached up and touched his face gently, marveling at the softness of his beard against her palm. "A chance to love and be loved by someone who sees me as I really am." Ezra's massive hands came up to cover hers, holding it against his cheek. "Are you saying yes?" "I'm saying yes to everything. Yes to marriage, yes to joining your community, yes to building a life together, and taking whatever risks that involve." Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes as she spoke. "Yes to the possibility that by winter, we might actually create the miracle we both want so desperately." For a moment, Ezra just stared at her, as though he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. Then, with a movement so gentle it took Sarah's breath away, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was nothing like the passionate, demanding kisses she had experienced with David. This kiss was tender and reverent, full of gratitude and promise, and something that felt like the beginning of love. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. "Are you sure?" Ezra asked, his forehead resting against hers. "Once we start this process, once we make this commitment public, there won't be any going back." "I'm sure," Sarah said, and was surprised to discover that she really was. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." The sound of footsteps in the barn doorway made them spring apart like guilty teenagers. Ruth appeared, her face bright with curiosity and hope. "Well," she asked without preamble, "are we planning a wedding?" Sarah looked at Ezra, then back at Ruth, and felt a smile spread across her face that seemed to come from her very soul. "We're planning a wedding," she confirmed. Ruth's whoop of joy was so loud it startled the horses in their stalls. She hurried over and enveloped Sarah in a hug that smelled like cinnamon and lavender, and all the maternal love Sarah had been missing for most of her life. "Oh, my dear girl," Ruth said, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "You've made us so happy. You've made an old woman's prayers come true." "What happens now?" Sarah asked, when Ruth finally released her. "I mean, practically speaking, what do we need to do to make this happen?" "First," Ezra said, his businesslike tone at odds with the joy in his eyes, "we need to speak with Bishop Miller, explain our intentions, and request permission for the marriage." "Will he agree?" Sarah asked, suddenly nervous about this crucial hurdle. "He'll agree," Ruth said confidently. "He's been worried about Ezra's situation, and this solves several problems at once. Besides, he likes you. You made a good impression during your first visit." "What else?" Sarah pressed. "You'll need to demonstrate your commitment to joining our community," Ezra explained. "That means learning our customs, our language, our ways of worship. Normally that would take months, but given the circumstances, we'll make it work," Ruth interjected firmly. "I'll teach you everything you need to know. We'll have you ready for marriage within the month." "A month?" Sarah felt a flutter of panic. "That's so fast. Winter comes whether we're ready or not," Ezra said gently. "And if we're going to fulfill my declaration, we need to move quickly." The reality of what they were attempting hit Sarah like a physical blow. Not only were they planning to marry within a month, but they were also hoping to conceive a child immediately afterward. The timeline was so compressed, so fraught with potential complications, that it seemed almost impossible. "What if it doesn't work?" she asked quietly. What if I can't get pregnant right away?" Ezra took her hands in his massive ones, his grip warm and reassuring. "Then we'll keep trying. And if it becomes clear that pregnancy isn't possible for us, we'll find other ways to build our family. But Sarah, I need you to know something." "What?" "Even if we never have children, even if my declaration turns out to be empty boasting, I would still want to marry you, not just because you solve my immediate problem, but because I believe we could build something real and lasting together." Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes again. "How can you be so sure? We barely know each other. I know that you drove 2 hours to investigate reports about a stranger because you cared about protecting children. I know that you stayed involved in this case even when it would have been easier to walk away. I know that you understand loss and grief in a way that most people never will, and that you haven't let that loss make you bitter or cynical." He paused, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "I know that you're brave enough to risk everything for the chance at happiness, and wise enough to recognize that love can grow from friendship and mutual respect just as easily as from passion. And I know that when I imagine my future now, I can't picture it without you in it." Sarah was openly crying now, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his voice and the magnitude of what they were committing to together. "We should go see Bishop Miller," she said when she could speak again. "If we're going to do this, we should start immediately. Are you sure you're ready?" Ruth asked gently. "Once we set this in motion, the entire community will know about your engagement. There will be no hiding, no changing your mind quietly." Sarah thought about her supervisor, waiting for her explanation, about the anonymous complaint that had already destroyed her career, about the empty apartment and lonely life waiting for her back in Philadelphia. "I'm ready," she said firmly. "Let's go change my life." The walk to Bishop Miller's farm took 20 minutes across rolling fields and country roads. Sarah found herself walking between Ezra and Ruth, listening to their quiet conversation in Pennsylvania Dutch, and marveling at how quickly her world was transforming. This morning she had been Sarah Matthews, social worker from Philadelphia, facing professional disgrace and personal loneliness. Tonight she would be Sarah Matthews, fiancée of Ezra Stoltzfus, preparing to join an Amish community and hoping to start a family before winter came. The change was so dramatic, so complete, that it should have terrified her. Instead, she felt a sense of rightness that she hadn't experienced in years, as though all the painful experiences of her past had been leading her to this moment, this choice, this chance at redemption. Bishop Miller's farmhouse was larger than the Stoltzfus' home, with a wide front porch and gardens that spoke of decades of careful tending. The bishop himself emerged from the barn as they approached, his piercing blue eyes taking in their little group with obvious curiosity. "Ezra, Ruth," he said formally, then nodded to Sarah. "Miss Matthews, this is an unexpected visit." "Bishop Miller," Ezra said, his voice forthright but firm. "We come to you with important news and a request for your blessing." The bishop's eyebrows rose. "What kind of news?" Ezra reached for Sarah's hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that felt both protective and possessive. "Miss Matthews has agreed to marry me," he said simply. "We seek your permission to proceed with the marriage preparations and your guidance in welcoming her into our community." For a long moment, Bishop Miller simply stared at them, his expression unreadable. Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she waited for his response. "Miss Matthews," the bishop said finally, "this is a very serious decision. Marriage is a sacred covenant, and joining our community requires complete commitment to our way of life. Are you prepared for such a dramatic change?" "I am," Sarah said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I understand that it won't be easy, but I'm committed to learning your customs and embracing your faith, and I'm committed to building a life with Ezra based on mutual respect and shared values." "And what of your work in Philadelphia, your life there?" Sarah took a deep breath. "My life there is ending whether I choose it to or not. I've been accused of unprofessional conduct in my handling of this case, and I'll likely lose my job, regardless of what I decide about Ezra's proposal." Bishop Miller's eyes sharpened. "Accused by whom?" "An anonymous complaint, someone who reported that I was spending too much time here, making too many personal visits." The bishop and Ruth exchanged glances that spoke of shared suspicion and understanding. "I see," Bishop Miller said slowly, "and you believe this complaint is related to Ezra's situation, to the community tensions surrounding his declaration." "I don't know," Sarah admitted, "but the timing is suspicious." Bishop Miller was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing multiple factors in his decision. When he finally spoke, his voice was grave but not unkind. "Ezra, your declaration has caused considerable disruption in our community. Some view it as prideful boasting, others as desperate folly. A few see it as a man's natural desire to prove his worth and build a family. And how do you see it?" Ezra asked. "I see it as a test," Bishop Miller replied. "A test of faith, of character, of your ability to find God's will even in the midst of great pain and social pressure." He turned to Sarah, his piercing gaze seeming to see straight through to her soul. "Miss Matthews, I believe your arrival in our community was not mere coincidence. Perhaps God sent you here for reasons that go beyond your professional duties. Perhaps you are part of his answer to Ezra's desperate prayer." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had never thought of herself as part of anyone's answered prayer, but there was something in the bishop's certainty that made her want to believe it might be true. "If that's the case," she said quietly, "then I want to be worthy of that trust." Bishop Miller nodded slowly. "Very well. I give my blessing to this union, with the understanding that you will both work diligently to prepare for marriage and integration into our community. Ruth, I trust you will oversee Miss Matthews' education in our ways." "Of course," Ruth said, beaming with obvious joy. "And Ezra, I trust you will approach this marriage with the seriousness and reverence it deserves, not merely as a means to win a bet or prove a point." "You have my word," Ezra said solemnly. "Then let us proceed. The marriage will take place in 3 weeks, giving Miss Matthews time to learn our essential customs and giving the community time to prepare." I will make the announcement at this Sunday's service. 3 weeks. Sarah felt a flutter of panic mixed with excitement. In 3 weeks, she would be Mrs. Ezra Stoltzfus, member of an Amish community, wife to a man she was only beginning to know. In 3 weeks, if all went according to plan, she would begin trying to conceive the child that would fulfill Ezra's impossible declaration and prove to an entire community that some dreams could come true against all odds. As they walked back to the Stoltzfus farm in the gathering twilight, Sarah felt Ezra's massive hand, warm and steady in hers. Tomorrow she would drive back to Philadelphia to face her supervisor and formally end her old life. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, she would go to sleep with hope in her heart and dreams of the future dancing in her mind. Winter was coming, just as it always did. But this year, Sarah Matthews would be ready for it. The first snow had come early that year, dusting the Pennsylvania countryside with a pristine white blanket that made the world look like a Christmas card. Sarah stood at the kitchen window of what was now her home, watching the flakes dance past the glass, and marveled at how much her life had changed in just 2 months. The woman who had driven down that country road in October, clutching her steering wheel and dreading a difficult investigation, no longer existed. In her place stood Sarah Stoltzfus, wife, community member, and if the doctor's news from yesterday was correct, expectant mother. "You're smiling." Ezra's deep voice came from behind her, and she felt his massive arms encircle her waist, pulling her back against his solid chest. Even after 3 weeks of marriage, his touch still sent shivers of wonder through her. "I have good reason to smile," she said, leaning into his warmth. The best reason. Their wedding had been a simple affair by English standards, but perfect by theirs. Sarah had worn a plain blue dress that Ruth had sewn for her, and Ezra had stood beside her in his black Sunday suit, his storm-grey eyes never leaving her face as they spoke. Their vows before the entire community. Bishop Miller had performed the ceremony with quiet dignity, speaking of God's mysterious ways and the blessing of second chances. The community had welcomed Sarah with a warmth that surprised her, though she suspected Ruth's relentless advocacy had smoothed many potential rough edges. But it was their wedding night that had truly changed everything. Sarah had been nervous, uncertain how physical intimacy would unfold between two people who had married for practical reasons, as much as romantic ones. Ezra had sensed her anxiety and spent hours simply talking with her, sharing stories of his childhood, his dreams for their future, his hopes for the children they might have together. When they finally came together as husband and wife, it had been with a tenderness and reverence that transformed what could have been awkward into something beautiful. There had been passion. Yes, but also something deeper, a sense of two broken souls choosing to heal together, choosing to believe that love could grow from the most unlikely soil. The doctor confirmed it. Ezra asked, his hand moving protectively to rest over her still flat abdomen. "Confirmed," Sarah said, turning in his arms to face him. 8 weeks along, due in early August. Ezra's face crumpled with emotion so intense that Sarah felt tears spring to her own eyes. He had tried so hard to hide his disappointment when November passed without news, when the first snow fell and his declaration seemed destined to remain unfulfilled. But now, as December snow danced outside their window, they had received the miracle they had barely dared to hope for. "By winter you'll birth my children," he whispered, his voice thick with wonder. "I said those words in anger and desperation, never believing they could come true." "Well," Sarah said with a watery laugh, "technically I'll give birth in summer, but I'm definitely pregnant by winter." Ezra threw back his head and laughed, a sound of pure joy that filled the kitchen and seemed to chase away the last shadows of doubt and grief that had haunted him for 3 years. He lifted Sarah off her feet and spun her around, both of them laughing like children. "Careful," Ruth's voice came from the doorway. Though she was smiling so broadly, her cheeks looked ready to crack. "We can't have you damaging my grandchild before it even arrives." Ezra set Sarah down gently, his hands immediately moving back to her waist, as though he needed to protect this precious new life from the very air around them. Grandchild, he repeated in wonder. Mom, you're going to be a grandmother again. About time, Ruth said practically, though tears were streaming down her weathered cheeks. I've been knitting baby clothes for weeks, just in case. Sarah looked between these two people who had become her family, who had taken a lonely, broken woman and given her belonging, purpose, and love beyond her wildest dream. The professional part of her mind still marveled at the sheer impossibility of what had happened, how a routine investigation had turned into a marriage proposal, how a marriage of convenience had become a love story, how two people who had given up on their dreams had found them in each other. I need to tell you both something, Sarah said, her voice growing serious. Something I should have said weeks ago. Ezra and Ruth both looked at her with concern, and Sarah felt a flutter of nerves in her stomach that had nothing to do with morning sickness. The day I decided to accept your proposal, she said, looking directly at Ezra, I told you my career was ending because of an anonymous complaint, but I never told you who I suspected was behind that complaint. Who? Ezra asked, his voice careful. David, my ex-fiancé. Sarah took a deep breath, knowing this revelation might change how they viewed her decision to marry Ezra. I think he found out about my frequent visits here and reported them to my supervisor. Ezra's face went very still. Why would he do that? Because 3 months ago, he called me, said he was getting divorced, that he had made a mistake when he left me. He wanted to try again, wanted to see if we could work through our issues and maybe adopt children together. Ruth's sharp intake of breath was audible, but Ezra said nothing, waiting for Sarah to continue. I told him no, told him that what we had was over, and I had moved on. He didn't take it well, said I was making a mistake, that I'd never find anyone else who would want a damaged woman. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she spoke. When he found out about my involvement with an Amish family, about the time I was spending here, I think he saw an opportunity to force me back to him by destroying my career and my options. And instead, Ezra said slowly, he drove you straight into my arms. Yes, Sarah said simply, his cruelty became the catalyst for our happiness. His attempt to control my life gave me the push I needed to choose a better one. Ezra was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Then, to Sarah's surprise, he smiled. I should send him a thank you note, he said. If he hadn't filed that complaint, you might have taken months to decide whether to accept my proposal. We might have missed our chance entirely. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had been worried that knowing about David's manipulation would taint Ezra's feelings about their marriage, would make him question whether she had chosen him for the right reasons. You're not angry? She asked. Angry at him? Yes. Angry at you? Never. Ezra cupped her face in his massive hands, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. Sarah, you could have told me about David's call from the beginning, and it wouldn't have changed anything. You still chose to stay involved with our case, when it would have been easier to walk away. You still chose to accept my proposal, when you could have gone back to him and salvaged your old life. But I made the choice partly because I had nowhere else to go, Sarah protested. Because he had destroyed my career and my options. You made the choice, Ruth interjected firmly, because you recognized love when you found it. Because you had the wisdom to see that sometimes the most practical decisions are also the most romantic ones. Is that what you think this is? Sarah asked, looking between them. A love story? What do you think it is? Ezra asked gently. Sarah considered the question seriously. What had started as professional obligation had become personal involvement, which had become mutual attraction, which had become marriage, which had become what? I think, she said slowly, that I love you. Not because you offered me a solution to my problems, not because you gave me a place to belong when I had nowhere else to go, but because you're the kindest, strongest, most generous man I've ever known. Because you make me feel safe and cherished and valued in ways I never thought possible. Ezra's smile was so radiant, it seemed to light up the entire kitchen. I love you too, he said simply. I loved you before I knew what I was feeling, before I understood that what started as desperation could become devotion." Ruth cleared her throat loudly, though she was still crying happy tears. "Well, now that we've established that this is indeed a love story, perhaps we should discuss practical matters, like where this baby is going to sleep, and whether we need to add on to the house, and how we're going to explain to the community that our practical arrangement has turned into the kind of romance that gives old women hope for the future." Sarah laughed, wiping her eyes on her apron. "I think the community already knows. Mrs. Yoder told me yesterday that she's never seen Ezra look so happy, and Mrs. King said it's obvious to anyone with eyes that we're besotted with each other." "Besotted?" Ezra repeated with amusement. "Is that what we are?" "Completely," Sarah confirmed, standing on her tiptoes to kiss him softly. As they stood there in the warm kitchen, snow falling outside and new life growing within her, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. All the pain and loss, all the professional disasters and personal disappointments, all the moments when hope had seemed like a luxury she couldn't afford. All of it had been leading to this, to Ezra's arms around her and Ruth's maternal love surrounding them both, to a community that had welcomed her despite her differences, to a child who would grow up knowing nothing but love and security and the quiet strength that came from being part of something larger than oneself. "Do you remember," she said to Ezra, "that first day when you roared at me about birthing your children by winter? I thought you were completely crazy." "I was completely crazy," Ezra admitted. "Crazy with grief and desperation and the fear that I would never have the family I wanted so badly. Now I think maybe crazy was exactly what I needed to be. Maybe sometimes you have to be willing to demand the impossible before the impossible becomes possible." Ruth moved to the stove, beginning preparations for dinner, with the efficient movements of someone who had spent decades nurturing family. "Speaking of the impossible," she said without turning around, "I have news of my own." Sarah and Ezra looked at her expectantly. "Elder Schmidt came by this morning while you two were at the doctor's office. It seems the community has taken up a collection." "What kind of collection?" Ezra asked. "Money to build a proper nursery for the baby, and materials for expanding the house." Ruth turned around, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "A fund to help other young people in the community who might be struggling with similar challenges." Sarah felt her heart constrict with emotion. They're doing it because your story has given them hope," Ruth explained. "Because you've shown them that sometimes God's greatest blessings come disguised as our worst problems. Because you've reminded them that love can grow in the most unlikely places and that faith sometimes requires taking enormous risks." Sarah looked out the window at the snow-covered fields where she had first encountered Ezra's rage and pain, where she had made the decision to stay involved when every professional instinct told her to walk away. The landscape looked so peaceful now, so serene and perfect, that it was hard to believe it had been the setting for such emotional turmoil just 2 months ago. "What are you thinking about?" Ezra asked, following her gaze. "I'm thinking about second chances," Sarah said. "About how sometimes the worst day of your life is actually the first day of your real life. About how by winter you'll birth my children turned out to be a prophecy instead of just angry words." Ezra's hand moved to rest over hers on her abdomen, and Sarah covered it with her other hand, creating a protective circle around the life they had created together. "By summer," he corrected gently, "you'll birth our child, our first child, God willing, but not our last." "How many children do you want?" Sarah asked, suddenly curious about this aspect of their future they had never discussed in detail. "How many will you give me?" he countered. Sarah thought about her empty apartment in Philadelphia, about the years of loneliness and professional achievement that had left her feeling hollow inside. She thought about this warm kitchen and Ruth's loving presence, about waking up each morning to Ezra's gentle strength and falling asleep each night in arms that made her feel completely safe. "As many as God sees fit to bless us with," she said. "And if he chooses not to bless us with more biological children, we'll fill this house with children who need homes. Children like I was after my parents died, lost and alone and desperate for someone to choose them. Ezra lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Have I told you lately that I love you, Mrs. Stoltzfus? Not in the last 5 minutes, Sarah said with mock severity. I was beginning to worry. I love you, he said solemnly. I love your courage and your compassion and your willingness to risk everything for the chance at happiness. I love that you saw past my anger to the pain underneath and that you chose to stay when leaving would have been easier. I love you too, Sarah whispered. I love that you kept your promise even though it seemed impossible. I love that you made me believe in fairy tales again. As the snow continued to fall outside and dinner filled the kitchen with warm, comforting smells, Sarah Matthews Stoltzfus rested her head against her husband's chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart. Their child, the child that would fulfill Ezra's desperate declaration and prove to an entire community that hope was never wasted, grew quietly within her, a testament to the power of faith, love, and the courage to demand the impossible. By winter she had indeed begun to birth his children. By winter, 2 broken hearts had found wholeness in each other. By winter, a love story that began with professional obligation and social work paperwork had become the kind of romance that would be told and retold for generations. And as the first winter snow of their marriage blanketed the Pennsylvania countryside in pristine white, Sarah and Ezra Stoltzfus stood together in their warm kitchen, surrounded by love and looking forward to a future filled with more blessings than either of them had ever dared to dream possible. Their fairy tale had come true after all.